can never tire of recalling that the 9 muses, the muses of literature and the performing arts, their mother was memory, no? And even when we tell stories to ourselves about origins, and this is something that the Greeks did with particular relish, they believed that they were telling stories that began at the beginning. And I'd like to just begin by referencing something that Plato narrates at the beginning of the Timaeus, his dialogue, where it's very interesting because here it's Critias, a character named Critias, who tells Socrates an old world story that he heard from his grandfather on the day of the apaturia, or the registration of youth, when Critias was 10 years old and his grandfather was over 90. And the grandfather had heard it in his youth from his father, who had heard it in turn from Solon the sage, the lawgiver, Athenian, who had heard it from an old priest during his visit to the Egyptian city of Sais. And we, in turn, hear Critias' account to Socrates from Plato, an abbreviated version of which I will now retell so that this river of cultural memory might flow on. So this is what happened. During his visit to Sais, Solon was asked by his Egyptian hosts to speak about Greek antiquity, and so Critias began to tell his Egyptian hosts about the first human being, Phoronius, and about Deucalion and Pyrrha and so forth, and then he was promptly interrupted by a venerable old priest who declared, "Oh, Solon, Solon, you Greeks are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you. In mind you are all young, and there is no opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age." And then the priest goes on to explain why the Greeks are so young in mind and spirit, or psyche, in their souls. And he says that Athens is even more ancient in its founding than the city of Sais, but the Greeks have no memory of its origins due to the annihilations of its former civilizations. And these annihilations are brought on by what the priest calls periodic declinations of the heavenly bodies that unleash a, quote, great conflagration of things upon the earth. That's somewhat vague, but we have to imagine cataclysms in the form of floods and probably volcanoes. And it was one of these conflagrations, says the priest, that destroyed Atlantis, an ancient civilization of which Solon's Greeks have no memory, even though it was their forefathers who thwarted the transoceanic Atlantean conquest of Europe. So this is the part of the Timaeus where we get the story of Atlantis, this fabled ancient civilization that actually is told in a way that still has people looking for the actual Atlantis somewhere, in the Pacific Ocean. So thanks to the flatness of the Nile Delta, Egypt manages to weather these cosmic upheavals without fatal consequences, whereas the mountainous terrain of Greece causes Athens and its neighboring cities to get devastated and washed away into the sea by these cataclysmic floods. So let me quote the priest. "Whereas in this land, in Egypt, neither then nor at any other time does the water come down from above on the fields, having always a tendency to come from below, for which reason the traditions preserved here are the most ancient. Whereas just when you and other nations are beginning to be provided with letters and the other prerequisites of life, after the usual interval, the stream from heaven like a pestilence comes pouring down and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education, and so you have to begin all over again like children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves." So I'd like to draw attention to the succinctness of the priest's distinction between Greek youth and, let's call it, Egyptian senility, as long as we understand the word senility not in the sense of decrepitude, but something that is hoary with age, that has a long age. So although the goddess Athena founded Athens 1,000 years before she founded Sais, the Egyptians possess an unbroken memory of and maintain a strict continuity with their deep past, whereas the Greeks keep losing their memory and starting all over again. And that's why I would venture to say that the symbol of Egyptian senility is the river of Greek youth, the volcano. And in its evocation of the several lost antiquities of Athens, because these cataclysms are recurrent, Plato's myth points, I believe, to a law of catastrophism that would continue to dominate Western civilization for centuries and millennia to come. Because like the Hellenes, Western civilization as a whole would, subsequent to Plato himself, be destined to periodically lose its memory, disinherit its past, and surrender its achievements to ruin. Ours is a civilization that for some reason cannot hold on to its legacies, that falls into dark ages of destitution and oblivion and must, quote, begin all over again like children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times. It always astonishes me that the first literary work in the Western canon is about the destruction and not the foundation of a city, destruction of the city of Troy. And we know that when Homer was writing, or when the Homeric tradition of these poems was originating in it was the dark ages of Greek times, and he was looking back to a lost civilization of the Mycenaeans, no? And whereas for us, Homer is the beginning of a civilization that we take to be our antiquity, it actually begins with the loss of a prior antiquity. Because the events that are under description in the Homeric epics are some 500 years before Homer was writing. And I would suggest that today we have the privilege of seeing this volcanic process at work up close, in technicolor as it were, as the entire Christian humanist civilization that slowly consolidated itself in the wake of Rome's collapse unravels before our eyes. It was said of President Garfield, late 19th century, that in moments of boredom or to amuse his friends, he would take a pencil in each hand and compose sentences in Greek and Latin at the same time. And if one considers that as a student, Thomas Jefferson used to translate the Greek Bible into Latin and vice versa, one realizes to what extent the heavenly declinations have unleashed their fury upon the American presidency. It was not so long ago that a university professor in the classroom would typically leave Greek and Latin quotes untranslated. Then he began to provide a translation for the Greek, but not for the Latin. Nowadays, he or she must tell his students or her students that there was such a thing as the Greek and Latin tongues, that there was once a place called Athens, and so forth. Shortly, the professor won't know even that much. Oh, he or she will know it in a way, but will not know what to make of it. And when you don't know what to make of something, you eventually forget about it. Aristotle has an interesting version of a similar sort of idea of catastrophism in the Metaphysics, where Aristotle did not believe in beginnings, and he believed in a kind of continuous, an eternal world, but he did believe that there were periodic catastrophes that wiped out the memory of the Greek civilizations. And he had this teleological view of all things, natural as well as cultural, and he thought that ultimate purpose of human society was to create the conditions for philosophers, no? That the few philosophers who would use their minds in a philosophical way were the ultimate goal and objective and telos of a human society. And he says somewhere in the Metaphysics, I believe it's in Book 12, that after these sorts of calamities take place, flood, volcanoes, and so forth, people will lose their memory, and then they will retell in the form of myth doctrines that the philosophers had themselves articulated philosophically in the prior age. And this is very interesting because we usually tend to think that myth precedes philosophy, that the mythos precedes logos, and that the logos then abstracts it. Aristotle gives a version where actually it's the memory of a philosophical logos that the early myths are actually referring to. And now that I've invoked this word logos, I'd like to go from the Greek and Roman civilization to the Christian very briefly to talk about how things stand with the concept of beginnings and memory there, at least invoking the beginning of the Gospel of John, which famously begins with the verse that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And in Greek, of course, it's in the beginning was the Logos. Now, even if we take it on faith that in the beginning was the Logos, no one really knows what Logos meant in the beginning, because by the time our words begin to mean something, they already have a past. They already reach us by way of our foremothers and forefathers. Regardless of our dialect, we speak with the words of the dead, and that, in a special sense, is how and why we speak at all. Just as humanity begins where there is already an ancestor, language begins where it has already begun. And there's a poem in Dylan Thomas's collection called From Love's First Fever to Her Plague, where Dylan Thomas confirms this, where he says, "And from the first declension of the flesh, I learnt man's tongue to twist the shapes of thoughts into the stony idiom of the brain, to shade and knit anew the patch of words left by the dead."